The air that morning carried the scent of wet pine and distant rain, the kind of sharp freshness that made the old forest seem alive, breathing with every sway of the tall trunks, and no one in the small town at the foot of Greymist Woods could have guessed that it would become the last day 5 friends would be seen alive. 10 years ago, in early June, when the sunlight fell in soft, dappled patterns across the winding roads and the calls of birds echoed through the canopy, a group of young adults, 2 brothers named Matthew and Chris, a quiet art student named Julia, her cousin Denise, and a man named Eric, who had been dating Denise for only a few months, packed up 2 cars with weekend supplies and headed deep into the hills. They were excited, laughing at the gas station as they filled coolers with ice, teasing each other over who had forgotten marshmallows or extra blankets, never realizing their names would soon be printed on missing posters. Their destination was an old wooden cabin tucked miles beyond the maintained trails, a place Matthew had discovered on a forgotten camping forum, a cabin with no official listing, no caretaker, just whispers from locals about hunters who once stayed there. The idea thrilled them, the thought of disappearing into a place where phone signals faded and the night sky would be free of city glare. On that drive, Julia played music softly on her phone, humming along as the narrow road curled like a ribbon through dense firs and moss-coated boulders. Eric joked about ghost stories, telling them how cabins like that were always in horror movies, and Chris laughed, saying it was just a cabin, just old wood and wind. By late afternoon, they arrived. The cabin stood in a clearing that looked almost staged, grass flattened in strange spirals, wildflowers bending toward the structure as if in reverence or warning. The porch sagged slightly, boards creaking underfoot, and a rusted lantern hung by the door. They carried their bags inside, and the air smelled of dust, old pine resin, and something faintly metallic. Windows were grimy but intact, and a heavy rug lay across the center of the living room, patterned with faded reds and golds. Outside, the forest loomed in every direction, deep green shadows that seemed to shift as the wind moved through them. They spent that first evening unpacking food, stringing up battery lights, and setting a fire in the old stone hearth. Denise took photos on her phone, grainy, low-light pictures of smiles and raised glasses, a memory frozen seconds before it slipped into darkness. As night fell, a fog drifted through the trees, muting every sound until the forest felt like a dream, and they went to sleep to the sound of crickets and the crackling fire. The next day, neighbors in town saw their cars still parked at the trailhead, empty and silent. By evening, when none of them returned calls or messages, concern began to spread. Denise's sister drove up first, thinking maybe they had stayed an extra night. But when she reached the clearing, the cabin door was ajar and the interior was eerily neat, untouched except for their bags stacked by the couch and their jackets still hanging on the wall. Their phones were there too, lined up on the old dining table as if someone had placed them intentionally. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints beyond the porch except their own. The sheriff's deputies arrived before midnight, combing through the surrounding woods with flashlights, calling out their names into a silence so thick it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Search teams swept the area over the next days, helicopters scouring tree lines, K9 units weaving through underbrush, volunteers wading through creeks and ravines, but the forest offered nothing back. No broken branches, no discarded clothing, no trail of disturbed moss. It was as if the 5 of them had stepped into the trees and been swallowed whole. The community reeled. Posters went up on every telephone pole, news crews set up near the trailhead, and interviews with tearful parents and friends aired on the local station every night. Theories bloomed like weeds: an accident, a bear attack, a secret cult, even a landslide no one had noticed, but none fit the facts. The cabin itself became a place of dread. The sheriff had it sealed off after the 3rd day, but a few locals swore they saw lights moving in the windows at night or heard faint voices echoing down the valley when no one should have been there. In the weeks that followed, the search widened, maps marked with grids and bright flags planted where evidence might lie. But again and again the teams came back with nothing. The sense of dread deepened, especially among those who knew the forest's older stories. Tales of miners who vanished in the 1800s, of hunters whose camps were found abandoned, Julia's mother visited the site every Sunday for months, leaving flowers on the porch steps, and one evening she swore she smelled her daughter's perfume in the wind, though no one else did. By autumn, the official search was called off, the case labeled inactive, but no one truly let go. The cabin remained standing, weathering winters and storms, visited only by the occasional thrill-seeker, yet always giving off that uneasy stillness, that sense that something waited beneath the surface. And then, almost a decade later, when most had stopped expecting any new answers, the owners of the surrounding land decided to renovate the cabin for short-term rentals. A local crew arrived, hauling tools and lumber, tearing out old boards and pulling up the heavy rug in the living room. That was when one of the workers, a man named Callan, who had lived in the area his whole life, noticed the slight outline of a trapdoor beneath the warped floorboards. The hinges were hidden under layers of grime and varnish, so subtle no one had seen them before. Callan crouched down, running his hand over the edge, feeling the give of a panel that had not been moved in decades. The room was quiet, sun slanting through the dusty window, and when he pried the boards up and the door groaned open, the air that rose from below was cold and stale, carrying a faint, sour smell that had no place in a simple cabin. He called for the others, their boots thudding across the boards as they leaned over the opening and stared into the dark square that yawned beneath the floor. A narrow wooden ladder descended into shadows. None of them spoke at first. It wasn't on any map, not mentioned in any of the old paperwork. For years, everyone believed the forest had hidden its secrets out among the trees, but it had been hiding something much closer, right beneath their feet. The news spread quickly, faster than anyone expected in a small town, where stories traveled by word of mouth before official channels caught up. And by the following morning the once-forgotten cabin was surrounded by sheriff's vehicles, crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze, and a team of investigators who had not stepped foot on that property in nearly a decade, now moving with a renewed intensity that bordered on obsession. Callan stood off to the side, arms crossed, chewing the inside of his cheek as he watched deputies descend the newly discovered ladder with high-powered flashlights, their beams cutting through the thick darkness below. The smell that wafted up from the hidden space beneath the cabin was enough to make one of the younger deputies gag quietly, though he tried to hide it. The scent of damp earth mixed with something older, something faintly organic, that clung to the air. Down below, the light caught on stone walls, hand-cut planks, and old crates stacked in corners, the remnants of some long-forgotten cellar that no one in town even knew existed. The first team emerged after 20 minutes, their faces drawn, exchanging hushed words with the sheriff, and though they would not speak to Callan or the small crowd that had gathered beyond the tape, everyone could see the way their eyes avoided the darkness, as if unwilling to look too long. For the families of the missing 5, this development struck like a physical blow. Julia's mother, now gray-haired and frail, was driven up to the site by her niece, and she stood by the tape clutching a photo in her hands, her eyes fixed on the porch as if willing her daughter to step out after all these years. Denise's father arrived later in the day, silent and stone-faced, placing both hands on the hood of his truck as if steadying himself against the rush of memory. The investigators worked methodically, photographing every inch of the cellar, cataloging old items pulled from the shadows, a rusted lantern, broken jars, a crate filled with decayed fabric, and marking a section where the dirt floor seemed disturbed, as though it had been dug up and refilled long ago. The sheriff called in a forensic archaeology team from the state capitol, and by nightfall bright work lights bathed the cabin's interior in harsh yellow, transforming the once cozy space into a glaring stage for secrets. Volunteers were kept at a distance, but they whispered among themselves, theories spilling out in low voices, memories of the search years ago resurfacing like ghosts. One older man claimed he remembered hunters talking about hidden cellars built during Prohibition, but no one could explain why this one had no record, no sign until now. Meanwhile, the team extended their search beyond the cabin, sweeping the nearby woods with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, hoping the discovery of the cellar would break open the mystery that had haunted them for so long. They found traces of old campsites, empty fire pits, and scattered animal bones that told no human story, and though the dogs were brought in again to circle the clearing, their noses leading them back to the cabin every time, Nothing else surfaced in those first 2 days. The press arrived by the third day, vans with satellite dishes lining the narrow dirt road, reporters and windbreakers delivering live updates against the backdrop of the forest, their voices measured but laced with the excitement of a story rekindled after so many years. Julia's mother gave a brief statement, her voice trembling as she said she still believed her daughter was alive, though her eyes betrayed the ache of someone who had lived a decade with unanswered questions. That same day, a deputy carefully lifted a warped section of the cellar's wall, revealing a narrow tunnel braced with rotting beams that sloped deeper into the earth, and a murmur passed through the team as they shone lights into it. The air from within was colder still, almost damp enough to bead on their faces, and the tunnel extended beyond what their lights could reach, curving sharply as if intentionally designed to be hidden. The sheriff made the decision to halt and bring in specialists, and that night the site was guarded by 2 cruisers, while the town buzzed with speculation. Old-timers recalled stories of men who built secret storage spaces to hide from tax collectors. Others swore the place had been used by bootleggers, and still others whispered darker things, that the woods themselves had a history of taking people, that strange fires and unexplained vanishings dotted the region's history going back over a century. For the investigators, the challenge was the same as it had been 10 years ago. The forest was vast, the evidence sparse, and time had stripped away so many traces. But now there was something tangible, a man-made structure that might hold the answers they had been denied. In the following days, teams in protective gear entered the tunnel, crawling through tight passages where the beams groaned ominously, their headlamps illuminating carved initials on the walls, old marks, likely decades old, until they reached a chamber lined with shelves that had once held jars or tools, but now sat empty, dust and cobwebs thick as a shroud. On the far wall of that chamber, someone had scratched faint symbols into the wood, unreadable at first glance, but clearly intentional, spirals and intersecting lines that made the seasoned detectives uneasy. They photographed everything, sent samples of the soil and went back to labs, and began building a new timeline, starting from the last confirmed moments when the 5 friends had been alive. In town, memorials were revived, candles lit in the church where vigils had been held 10 years earlier, and families held each other with the same fierce grip they had back then, as though bracing for answers they weren't sure they wanted. The sheriff gave daily press briefings, careful to release only confirmed information, but every word hinted at the same underlying truth. They were closer than they had ever been, yet the scope of what they might find was growing darker by the day. Search teams returned to the old maps of the region, overlaying modern aerial images with century-old survey records, searching for any mention of tunnels or storage pits, and they found references to mining operations that had been abandoned in the 1920s, shafts that crisscrossed beneath the hills like veins. Some believe the cabin had been built atop one of these shafts, deliberately or by accident, and that the tunnel now discovered might connect to something far larger than anyone imagined. As the second week of renewed searching came to a close, tension in the air felt like a storm waiting to break. Reporters camped in vans with their lights dimmed. Investigators worked late into the night under the glare of portable floodlamps, and the families of the missing huddled in folding chairs outside the tape, unwilling to leave. The sound of wind through the trees took on an eerie resonance, carrying fragments of conversation, the metallic clang of shovels striking buried stone, and somewhere in that symphony of effort and memory was the same haunting question that had lingered for a decade. Where did they go? And why had the forest remained silent all these years? As summer turned to autumn and the leaves of gray mist woods shifted from deep green to molten shades of amber and rust, the renewed investigation began to slow, not because interest faded, but because the tunnel and the cellar yielded only fragments of information that led nowhere concrete, and soon the same familiar frustration settled over the team, like a damp fog. The shelves in the hidden chamber were photographed, dust samples analyzed, the carved symbols sent to experts in regional folklore, but nothing tied directly to the missing 5, and each passing day felt like the echo of 10 years ago when the initial search spread wider and wider until hope thinned out like mist. The family stayed involved at first, attending every press update, but weeks turned into months, and the story that had burned bright on news channels began to dim as other headlines took its place. leaving behind only those who had lived with the loss for a decade and now feared they might have to live with it forever. Julia's mother stopped coming to the site in October, telling reporters through tears that she could not watch the cycle repeat again, and Denise's father, though quieter, began placing small wooden crosses along the trail that led to the cabin, each marked with a date and the initials of the missing, as if creating a breadcrumb path through his own grief. The sheriff's department kept a skeleton crew on the case, combing through old tips and digitalizing boxes of notes, while online forums that had once obsessed over the disappearance experienced a resurgence, strangers analyzing satellite images, debating theories late into the night, spinning wild connections that investigators dismissed but secretly read in the quiet hours, hoping for that one overlooked clue. A year slipped by with nothing but silence from the woods, the cabin padlocked now, the trapdoor sealed by order of the county, and the property returned to a kind of uneasy stillness, the porch collecting leaves, the wind humming through warped boards. On anniversaries, a few townsfolk still gathered at the trailhead to light lanterns, their soft glow floating into the dark like fragile prayers, but fewer came each year, and those who did spoke less and less, their words replaced by long stares into the tree line. Then came a winter storm that brought down trees and flooded the narrow dirt road, closing off the area for weeks, and when crews finally cleared the debris in early spring, rumors began circulating that the landowner was planning to sell the property outright, eager to leave behind the whispers and strange attention. Investigators made one last pass through the files, finding nothing new, and officially the case drifted back into the cold archives, a story that remained in the minds of those directly touched by it, but otherwise faded into local lore. Still, unease lingered, and hikers spoke of avoiding that particular stretch of forest, claiming they felt watched near the old clearing or heard faint tapping sounds in the distance, though no one ever stayed long enough to investigate. Years continued to layer over the mystery like fallen leaves, and in that passage of time the world changed. New phones, new cars, new families in town, but the cabin and the secret beneath it remained frozen in the past, a scar in the earth left unopened. Then, on the 10th anniversary of the disappearance, a group of amateur documentary makers arrived in town, their interest sparked by the resurfaced news articles and grainy photos of the cabin's trapdoor, and they began interviewing locals, including Callan, who told them with a faraway look in his eyes about the smell that rose from below, about the symbols carved into wood that no one could explain. The crew hiked to the site, cameras rolling, though they could only film from beyond the tape still wrapped around the porch, and they spoke in low tones about hidden rooms and forgotten tunnels, their words drawing curious onlookers and stirring the embers of grief in those who had worked so hard to let the forest silence settle. One evening, as the crew packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, an older woman approached them, saying she remembered something her father had told her decades ago, about a family that vanished in the same woods in the late 1960s, their campsite found abandoned with food still cooking over the fire. The crew filmed her quietly, the cicadas singing in the background, her voice trembling as she recounted details that sounded eerily familiar. When they cross-referenced her story with old records, they found nothing official, but the eerie parallels renewed online speculation, threads filled with side-by-side comparisons of the two vanishings, timelines drawn with digital pins and red lines as if solving a puzzle no one else could. Despite all the chatter, the sheriff's office remained silent, offering no new comment, and within months the crew released a short film online that went viral briefly, a haunting montage of the forest, the boarded-up cabin, and interviews with those still haunted by the loss. For a few weeks it felt like the world was watching again, but just as quickly the attention drifted elsewhere, leaving behind only the heavy stillness of gray mist woods and the knowledge that some answers might never be found. Time moved on, as it always does, but beneath the floor of that cabin the hidden tunnel remained, dark and undisturbed, a place where the air stayed cold no matter the season, and where, perhaps, the forest still kept its secrets buried, waiting for some future accident of chance or curiosity to reveal what truly happened to those 5 who walked into the trees and never came back. It was a humid morning in late July when the first real breakthrough in years arrived, not through a formal investigation, but by pure accident, when a retired schoolteacher named Howard Hensley took his dog, a restless old retriever named Scout, on a walk through the edges of gray mist woods where the maintenance crews had recently cleared fallen timber, opening up narrow deer trails that hadn't been passable in years, and Howard, who had lived in the region his whole life, liked to wander those hidden paths, humming softly, feeling the crunch of pine needles under his boots. Scout ran ahead, tail whipping through ferns, and Howard followed, swatting at mosquitoes, until the dog stopped abruptly near a slope where thick roots knuckled out of the earth, and a patch of ground looked oddly smooth compared to the rest of the forest floor. At first he thought nothing of it, maybe just old erosion, but then he noticed a scrap of faded fabric snagged on a thorn bush nearby, blue and frayed like it had weathered seasons of rain and sun. Kneeling carefully, he picked it up and felt a jolt when he saw what looked like a tiny embroidered flower along the edge, a pattern strangely familiar, though he couldn't place why. Scout whined softly, pawing at the earth where the soil seemed unnaturally loose, and Howard hesitated before using a fallen branch to scrape at the top layer of dirt, revealing something hard beneath, something not stone but synthetic, streaked with mud. His breath caught as he realized it was a corner of a backpack, the fabric mottled and dark but intact, the zipper still closed. Heart pounding, he brushed away more soil, revealing a strap and a tarnished metal buckle, and a sick chill moved through him as memory clicked into place. He had seen that pattern of embroidered flowers before, on missing posters tacked to store windows a decade ago. Shaking, he called Scout to heel and pulled out his old flip phone, his voice trembling as he told the dispatcher what he had found. By mid-afternoon, the clearing was swarming with uniforms again, yellow tape unfurling through the trees, and Howard sat on a fallen log, clutching a bottle of water as investigators knelt in the dirt, gloved hands lifting the backpack into evidence bags, cameras flashing, murmurs rippling through the team as they cataloged every item. Inside they found a compact mirror, rusted and cracked, a small flashlight corroded with age, and a single sneaker whose laces had been tied in a hasty double knot, all of them matched within hours to Julia, the art student who had vanished that night. For the first time in 10 years, there was tangible evidence beyond the cabin itself, a breadcrumb leading them deeper into the labyrinth of gray mist woods, and the news spread like wildfire, reviving every dormant fear and theory. The sheriff, older now and lined with years of regret, spoke at a hastily arranged press conference, confirming the discovery and announcing that search operations would resume in the area surrounding the site. Families who had spent years staring at blank landscapes now clutched at this new lead, tears streaming as they watched footage of the backpack being carried away. Julia's mother returned to the woods for the first time in years, leaning on her niece's arm, whispering her daughter's name as if the forest might answer. In the days that followed, teams scoured the surrounding terrain, using drones to map elevation changes, combing over every hollow and ridge, and while some areas yielded only animal burrows and rusted hunting gear, others seemed promising, marked with bright flags for further excavation. Then, 2 days after the backpack was found, a searcher's spade struck wood beneath a tangle of roots only 30 yards downhill from the discovery site, revealing the edge of what appeared to be an old storage chest, the kind used decades ago by trappers or miners. When they pried it open, it was empty save for a few scraps of disintegrated cloth and a thin layer of ash, but its presence suggested human activity far deeper into the woods than anyone expected. The find electrified the team, prompting deeper searches with cadaver dogs, whose noses twitched in the heavy summer air as they led handlers in wide circles, sometimes pausing to bark at patches of ground where nothing was visible. Forensic analysts brought in from a state lab examined the backpack in detail, extracting tiny samples of hair caught in the zipper and testing them, and when the results confirmed Julia's DNA beyond doubt, a cold wave passed through every person who had ever searched for her. Among the items recovered was a scrap of notebook paper fused to itself with moisture, and under infrared scanning faint words emerged, partial sketches and fragments of sentences, one clearly reading, "We heard something under the floor," sending shivers through the investigative team. That note, combined with the known trapdoor and tunnel beneath the cabin, suggested the missing group might have discovered something unsettling during their stay, something that never made it into any official timeline. The sheriff ordered a new inspection of the cabin itself, bringing in structural engineers to map every hidden cavity, and when they lowered a camera deeper into the tunnel, they discovered a secondary passage branching off, previously overlooked due to debris, leading farther underground. Progress was slow, dangerous, and every creak of the old supports echoed like a warning, but curiosity pushed them forward. By the end of that week, searchers emerged pale and shaken, reporting that the tunnel widened into another chamber, this one carved directly into stone, lined with shelves of jars filled with unidentifiable remnants, and in the far corner a mound of earth shaped unnaturally square, as though someone had buried something long ago and marked it with a crude plank. The sheriff halted the exploration until proper archaeological tools could be brought in, but whispers spread quickly through the team and out into the town, whispers of what might lie beneath that mound and who might have placed it there. For the families, hope and dread mingled in equal measure, the possibility of answers, both a balm and a fresh wound, and for the first time in years the woods seemed alive again, not with birdsong or wind, but with the heavy weight of secrets about to surface. ChatGPT. The following weeks unfolded with an intensity the town had not felt since the first frantic days 10 years earlier, as state investigators, forensic specialists, and structural engineers converged on Grey Mist Woods, determined to excavate the stone-carved chamber discovered beneath the cabin, and under bright floodlights they worked with painstaking care, brushes and small trowels peeling back layers of compacted soil from the unnatural mound in the corner, while deputies logged every artifact unearthed, each fragment a whisper from the vanished. On the second day of digging, a metallic clink rang out, and the team uncovered a rusted belt buckle, followed by what appeared to be bone fragments too old and weathered to identify immediately, prompting the sheriff to close off the area completely and issue a guarded statement to the press about possible human remains, pending confirmation. In parallel, the notebook scrap recovered from Julia's backpack underwent enhanced spectral analysis, and under the watch of experts in the state crime lab, more faded writing appeared, words like strange sounds, scratching, and someone else here. Chilling phrases that hinted the group may have realized too late they were not alone. This revelation drove investigators to pore over local records again, revisiting old employment rosters for forest rangers, seasonal workers, and contractors known to frequent the remote areas a decade ago. It was during one of these late-night sessions, with rain tapping the windows of the county building, that a young analyst cross-referenced DNA from the backpack's hair against a national database and came back with a partial match, not to a victim, but to a man once flagged in another investigation years after the disappearances, a maintenance worker who had quietly left his job with the Parks Department and moved 3 towns over, living under a different variation of his name. His file had slipped through cracks because no one thought to connect him to the area, but now the pieces aligned, and within hours surveillance teams were dispatched to observe his current residence, a modest single-story home with overgrown hedges and a yard cluttered with rusting tools. From a distance, he looked ordinary, a solitary figure who spent afternoons tending to a vegetable patch and evenings sitting on his porch with a radio playing old country songs. But the investigators noted strange patterns. His trips into the nearby woods late at night, his careful habit of burning trash rather than disposing of it, and his repeated visits to a storage unit rented under an alias. They set up cameras, tracking his movements, documenting every purchase and phone call, slowly building a case as the lab expedited testing on soil samples from the tunnel. Those tests came back with unsettling results. Traces of human blood preserved in the clay near the chamber's far wall, degraded but enough to warrant warrants. When deputies and state agents finally moved in, they did so quietly, approaching his home at dawn, the mist rising from the grass as they spread out around the perimeter. He opened the door before they could knock, as if he had been expecting them, and stood framed in the doorway, a gaunt man in his 60s with pale eyes and a faint smile that unsettled even the most seasoned detective. The search of his property revealed boxes of old maps, photographs of wooded trails, and, hidden beneath false panels in his garage, a collection of personal items, necklaces, hair ties, and camping utensils that matched descriptions from multiple missing persons cases across the region. The sheriff, now grim-faced, announced to the families that they had a suspect in custody, though many questions remained unanswered. In an interrogation room lit by a single buzzing fluorescent light, The man spoke softly, answering some questions with cryptic calm, denying others with a shrug, his voice carrying the dry rasp of someone unbothered by the weight of his words. When asked about the 5 friends who vanished 10 years ago, he tilted his head and said only, "They found something that wasn't meant to be found," a statement that sent shivers through the room and raised more questions than it answered. Forensics continued their work in the tunnel, uncovering more bone fragments and personal effects, while the suspect's life was dissected piece by piece, neighbors describing him as helpful but private, co-workers recalling how he knew the forest better than anyone, able to vanish off trail for hours without a sound. Rumors spread like wildfire, some claiming he had lived in those tunnels for years, others whispering he had built them himself to store things no one should see. But nothing concrete emerged yet, and the sheriff cautioned against speculation. Still, the evidence piled up, photographs of items seized from his home compared with missing persons reports from the last 20 years, and patterns began to emerge. The victims all disappeared near remote structures, cabins or hunting shacks long abandoned, places where he might have felt safe to watch, to wait. Even with the arrest, the families could not rest, not without knowing where their loved ones had ended up. And so the excavation continued, the stone chamber yielding secrets, inch by inch, as investigators mapped every beam and marked every finding. Late one night, as floodlights cast long shadows against the trees, a deputy crouched at the edge of the excavation and uncovered what appeared to be the corner of another trapdoor, this one smaller, hidden beneath a lattice of roots, leading even deeper. The team paused, exchanging wary looks, because each discovery seemed to lead only to more darkness, more questions, and yet they kept digging, driven by the hope that somewhere in those cold tunnels lay the truth that had haunted the town for a decade. ChatGPT. The final descent into the newly uncovered trapdoor came at dawn, the mist still thick over gray-mist woods, as a specialized team lowered themselves one by one into the narrow shaft, their headlamps casting fractured beams that slid across rough stone and exposed timbers, and the air grew colder the deeper they went, until it smelled not of earth alone, but of something metallic and old, a silence so complete it made every breath seem deafening. The chamber they entered was smaller than the others, but more deliberate, the walls lined with rough shelving that held glass jars sealed with wax, their contents unidentifiable at first glance, and on the far side a wooden beam had been placed upright, like a marker beside a shallow depression in the floor. As shovels gently worked away the soil, the first shape emerged, a fragment of a denim sleeve, still clutching what remained of a leather bracelet Julia's mother had described a decade ago, and then more shapes followed, bones arranged in a way that spoke of hasty burial, of someone who did not care enough to grant dignity. The team worked in silence, reverence mixing with dread, as they unearthed enough to confirm what everyone feared but needed to know. The missing 5 had not wandered away. They had been taken and left here, beneath the cabin they had come to for rest and laughter. Word reached the surface slowly, the sheriff stepping away from the entrance to call the families personally, his voice breaking as he told them they had found their loved ones, that they could finally come home. And though there was grief, there was also a stillness in those words, an end to the endless wondering. The suspect, confronted with the evidence, at first smiled and shook his head, but when shown photographs of the recovered items and remains, his shoulders slumped and he began to speak, not in remorse, but in cold detail, explaining how he had watched them arrive at the cabin that night, how he had waited until the storm masked his steps, how he had lured them below with the promise of something old hidden in the cellar, and how, when they realized what he intended, it had been too late to escape. He claimed he had used those tunnels for years, that others had wandered too close before, that he kept things because he could not let go, and when pressed about why, he gave only a hollow laugh and said, "Because no one ever looks down there." The confession was recorded, transcribed, analyzed, and yet it offered no comfort beyond the certainty of guilt, no explanation that could satisfy the enormity of the crime. Excavation continued for days, each fragment catalogued, each personal item returned to families in carefully sealed envelopes, and the remains, once fully recovered, were laid out with care and transported under escort to the county coroner's office. The town held a candlelight vigil in the church square, hundreds gathering with photographs, flowers, and whispered prayers. The names of the 5 read aloud one by one, each followed by the toll of the bell that echoed through the dark like a heartbeat. The cabin itself was ordered demolished after the investigation concluded, its beams and boards pulled down until only a scar of disturbed earth remained, later replaced by a simple memorial of stone and wildflowers where visitors could stand and remember. In the weeks that followed, safety protocols were strengthened across the region, abandoned structures cataloged and sealed, maps updated, and warning signs posted. And though it could not undo what had been done, there was a sense that the woods were no longer entirely silent, that they had spoken their secrets at last. Julia's mother, standing by the memorial, pressed her hand to the engraved names and whispered that she could finally stop imagining where her daughter might be. And Denise's father placed the last of his wooden crosses beside the stone, closing his eyes as if to offer a final promise. Reporters moved on. Investigators filed their reports. But in quiet corners of the town the story would be told again and again, a cautionary tale wrapped in sorrow and perseverance. Howard Hensley, the retired teacher whose dog had found the first clue, was invited to speak at the memorial's dedication, his voice trembling as he described the day Scout pawed at the earth, and he ended by saying he had not been searching for anything, only walking, proof that sometimes answers are found not by force but by chance. In the courtroom, the suspect showed no emotion as the verdict was read, life sentences stacking like stones, and though no justice could bring back what was lost, there was a collective exhale in that room, a release of years of tension and fear. Grey Mist Woods remained as it always had, vast, green, and beautiful, but those who walked its trails now carried a different awareness, a respect for the stories it held and the shadows that lingered beneath its canopy. In the evenings, when the wind moved through the pines and the memorial caught the last light of sunset, it was said you could almost hear the echoes of laughter, faint and fleeting, like the forest itself was remembering those who had come seeking peace and instead found a place in its tragic history, and in that mingling of grief and hope the town found its fragile closure, holding tight to the belief that even in the deepest dark, the truth can rise to the surface if someone, somewhere, keeps looking. ChatGPT